Welcome to AskFOI, where we answer the most common questions we receive about prophecy, Israel, and the Bible. With me for this episode is David Gunn. Welcome, David.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
David, readers of the Old Testament and the New Testament will come across a phrase about 25 times, depending on your translation, the day of the Lord. What is the day of the Lord?
The day of the Lord is an expression we find, you're right, mostly in the Old Testament, right around 20 times there, and then a few times in the New Testament as well. You'll notice it mostly occurs in prophetic literature. So you're looking at the writing prophets of the Old Testament, that's where you find the term used most frequently. And then a few times in the New Testament, again, primarily in prophetic literature, dealing with end times prophecy and things of that nature. When you see the day of the Lord, you might think that what the writer has in mind there is a specific day, like a 24-hour day or a day that you might be able to circle on the calendar and say, there it is, there's the day of the Lord. But that's not really the idea in most cases. The word day that's used here can mean a 24-hour day, and oftentimes it does. But it can also be used in a broader sense, like when we might say, oh, back in my day, or back in the good old days, right? Just kind of a general period. And more frequently when we see the day of the Lord, that's kind of the sense with which day is being used there. The commonality, the common element that you see in all of the uses of that expression is that whenever you have the day of the Lord occurring, what you're seeing is a time when God intervenes, when God interrupts the ordinary events of human history, and he's interrupting them specifically to pour out his judgment on evildoers. So it's not exactly a positive, cheery expression, the day of the Lord. And you can see that just by looking at how it's used. Oftentimes the prophets talk about how it's a day of darkness, right? A day of gloom, a day of thick darkness, and so on. Occasionally, the judgment that is referred to in these Day of the Lord passages would be a judgment that was future from the prophet's perspective, but that is past from our perspective. That happens a few times where they're talking about judgments that are now in the ancient past from where we're situated. Judgments on Judah, judgments on Egypt, judgments on Babylon that took place in biblical history, for example. More often, however, I would say in the majority of the times that the Bible talks about the day of the Lord, it's looking much further into the future to the tribulation period. And so typically the prophets have that in mind, either the tribulation period considered as a whole, or sometimes specific instances of judgment within the tribulation. Especially those judgments that are associated with the Battle of Armageddon, the second coming of Jesus Christ, and so on. So whenever we see the day of the Lord, it is one of these expressions of divine judgment. Possibly historical, possibly future and eschatological, usually future and eschatological. It's a teaching that tends to fill the heart with a certain amount of foreboding when you read about it, right? God is a wrathful God who is going to pour out his judgment on evildoers. Not one of the more popular aspects of biblical Christianity these days. That's kind of a politically incorrect way of thinking about God. But that is how the Bible presents him, a God who is a God of love, yes, but also a God of holiness. And because a God of holiness, also a God of wrath. And thus a day is coming, the Bible teaches, this day of the Lord, in which he will judge evildoers.
I want to pick up on something you said about this not being really taught in churches today. It's what my experience is. You just don't hear about this on Christian radio. The day of the Lord, it seems it's often avoided as a topic. But why is it significant? Why is it not something we should just kind of put on the side? Why is it important for us to know today?
Well, one obvious answer would be that it's in the Bible, and anything that's in the Bible needs to be taken seriously, right? So you could say that about pretty much anything that's taught in the Scriptures. But to get a little bit more specific, I think we all have a recognition deep down within us that the world is not exactly the way that it should be. Something is broken, something is off. The human condition is one that is fundamentally broken, and that brokenness extends beyond humanity into the entire created order to one degree or another. The story of the Bible concludes with all that was wrong being made right. It finishes up with a new creation, a new heaven, a new earth, in which all the former things which were broken and which were messed up are set right again. And that's a very beautiful picture of where we're headed. But you cannot get to the new heavens and the new earth without first going through the day of the Lord. That's a very crucial point in the Bible, that because sin has entered the cosmos, sin must be dealt with, sin must be judged. One possibility for having your sin problem dealt with is by believing in the person and work of Jesus Christ, and that gets into the doctrine of salvation. But of course, there are those who reject Christ, who reject his sacrifice for sin. And so therefore, that element of sin, both within individuals and within society as a whole, has to be dealt with and has to be judged because of God's holiness. That's where the teaching of the day of the Lord comes in. That is the moment at which God finally says, my patience has run its course, and now I'm going to set things right one way or another.
Really helpful. Thank you, David.
Thank you.